I want to turn now to Robert Dreyfuss in Washington. First, since they're not commenting at all, can you explain how you understand the raid went down, what exactly happened? For our radio listeners, on our TV show, we're showing the video of the aftermath of the bodies, of the coffins of the people mourning and people marching in the streets. Robert Dreyfuss.
Well, you know, part of the problem, of course, is that there are conflicting reports about what happened and what didn't happen, but it appears, at least, that this was not just an air raid, but this was actually a raid involving commandos and helicopters. Something like the attack, I would say, that happened on September 3rd, the one and only time that we know about in Afghanistan, where American forces crossed into Pakistan and conducted an on-the-ground raid inside Pakistan. In both of these cases, they seem to be the logical expression of a decision that was made over the summer by the president, allowing U.S. Special Operations Forces to conduct these cross-border or hot pursuit raids into countries, in Pakistan's case, an ally, and in Syria's case, an adversary, I guess, to conduct these cross-border raids against people who the United States decided that it didn't like. Based on intelligence, we have, you know, extremely aggressive intelligence methods and surveillance and drone aircraft and everything else that watch these people sometimes for hours or days at a time. And it in turn raises the question now of whether the United States might consider similar raids into Iran, which is over the past 2 years has been increasingly blamed by the United States for supporting militant activity by especially Shiites in Iraq, based in training camps and transit facilities and so forth, both outside Tehran and along the Iran-Iraq border. I describe this as kind of a parallel doctrine to the Bush doctrine, where you had earlier the Bush doctrine that said we can conduct preventive military action against countries that you know, we perceive to be possibly threatening. In this case, now we're conducting special forces or commando attacks against bases or facilities in countries that we think are harboring people who are conducting attacks on American or allied forces. This is a very, very, very troubling thing. If you go back to the origins, the beginning of the so-called war on terrorism, this is what it was supposed to look like. And last week I went to see Mike Vickers, who commands the Special Operations Forces. Not commands them, but he's the Assistant Secretary of Defense. He described how that unit, those forces have doubled pretty much under the Bush administration and are set for further expansion. And this is a huge tool that's now been created that can be used in many, many situations in many countries. He said they operate now in 60 countries. So this is potentially a major escalation of the war on terrorism just at the declining days of the Bush administration.
And Robert Dreyfuss, the impact within Iraq itself, I mean, obviously already one of the sticking points in reaching an agreement with the Iraqi government over the retention of U.S. forces in Iraq is the issue that the Iraqi government is now saying, well, we want this agreement to include that there will be no attacks on other countries by U.S. forces on Iraqi soil.
Yeah, this pretty much, you know, puts the final nail in the coffin of the idea that the U.S. and Iraq are going to come to some kind of state of forces agreement. I've been saying for 6 months that there was no chance that this agreement could be signed because of opposition inside Iraq. The big irony here is that only recently Syria decided to send an ambassador to Iraq, and by the way, also send an ambassador to Lebanon. 2 major steps by Syria to try to build bridges both to its neighboring countries but to the world at large. And this is a huge slap in the face to that effort. The Iraqis now have protested the attack on Syria. They've promised the Syrians that they would conduct their own investigation and report to Damascus about what they find out. And this has created a nationalist backlash inside Iraq that I think is astonishingly bad for any effort by the Bush administration to try to conclude this agreement about what U.S. forces can and can't do from Iraq. Now, maybe that happened because they realized that it's already too late for that agreement, and there won't be any agreement. So it looks like that's going back to the United Nations sometime next month.
Robert Dreyfuss, in your piece, The End of International Law, you have a quote of Robert Gates in the Washington Post saying, "We'll do what's necessary to protect our troops." That's what he said in the Senate. When asked about cross-border operations, he said he was not an expert in international law, but assumed the State Department had consulted such laws before the U.S. military was granted authority to make such strikes. You go on to talk about Robert Gates in the context of an Obama administration. Let's put this now in the context of the last days of this campaign. First, Barack Obama and what he has said about Defense Secretary Robert Gates.
Well, several of Barack Obama's advisors, especially Richard Danzig, who is his key inside advisor on military affairs, has suggested overtly, publicly, that Senator Obama might keep Robert Gates on as Secretary of Defense. And several of Obama's advisors have suggested to me privately the same thing. I mean, I would find that very troubling if he's going to continue to keep Gates on as Secretary of Defense, not only because of his association with Bush and the war on terrorism, but his own past as someone who's manipulated intelligence. You know, he's got a long record going back to the 1980s as someone who's rigged the intelligence game to fix it in favor of policy. I don't know whether Obama will, in fact, keep Gates on, but certainly by saying that he, doesn't know much about international law, he didn't make a good case for himself, I would say.
And in terms of Obama himself and policy in the region, obviously, while he's been opposed to the Iraq war, he continues to support the increasing the number of troops in Afghanistan. And in your interviews with Susan Rice, one of his major foreign policy advisors, you suggest that he will be much more aggressive when it comes to, quote, humanitarian interventions by the United States around the world.
Yeah, well, this is something that is going to have to get resolved early on in an Obama administration. There's no question that there are many people around Senator Obama who think that the use of American military force to solve not only, of course, cases of genocide, but of civil violence and severe repression and violation of human rights in other countries is something that the United States has to consider. And as often as not, and certainly in the case of Iraq, that was used as one of the main pretexts for going into Iraq, that Saddam had gassed his own people. You remember President Bush saying that. And so the idea that we're going to use more and not less military force abroad is something that I think Obama is going to have to make very clear, whether that's his view or not. He has called, as you said, for an escalation of the war in Afghanistan. He has called for intensified military pressure on Pakistan, including endorsing the idea of cross-border attacks there against what he calls high-value targets. I don't know. He hasn't said whether he means that to be just Islamic militants or actually top al-Qaeda leaders. But in any case, he's certainly left the door open for this kind of activity. And when I saw Mike Vickers, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations last week, I asked him if he was prepared for a new administration, of his unit at the Pentagon and his 60,000 operators, including many of them in covert form, are prepared for a new boss in the White House and what he expects. He kind of ducked the question. And that's another huge military apparatus that the new president is going to have to decide what he wants to do with and whether he wants to continue to grow it. All the signs are that, Senator Obama does, in fact, look with favor on the continued growth of the U.S. Special Operations Command.